warm welcome to everyone here at the beautiful French Embassy in Berlin. Really special place, and we're really privileged to be able to have our second Responsible Capitalism Summit in this special location. My name is Patrick Bolton. I'm a fellow of ECGI, and I'm a co-organizer of this conference, especially being responsible for this morning. Let me begin with a few remarks on why responsible capitalism and what is responsible capitalism. Some of you may not know this. ECGI was founded in 2001. It's the leading global corporate governance platform, bringing together scholars, policymakers from around the world, and scholars, which is unique, that are in finance, law, and economics. I won't mention how many thousands of working papers have been produced over this time. But, how do you get from corporate governance to responsible capitalism? So that's a couple of words on that. I thought I'd give you a quote. Henry Ford, 1917, he was a defendant in a case in Michigan against the shareholders of his company. And the case was about his ambition as CEO and founder of his company of expanding car production. And this was not what the shareholders wanted. The shareholders wanted profits. And what did Henry Ford say at the trial? He said about the purpose of his business. He said, "Business is a service, not a bonanza." And more or less at the same time, there was a remarkable article published in the Journal of Political Economy by a professor of economics at Chicago, Maurice Clark, with the title on responsible economic responsibility. And what did Maurice Clark say? What did he mean by responsibility? He said, many things, many interesting things, but I can only give you one quote. He said, responsibility means, or acting responsibly as a business means to get value only for value given. And I think that summarizes things very well for what we're trying to achieve here by pushing the theme of responsible capitalism. And obviously we all are aware of the context today with an environmental and climate crisis. And so not surprisingly, this has become a front and center issue for corporate governance. Marco Becht, who's the director of ECGI, and I, we teach a course on corporate governance at Imperial College. And over the years, we've added more and more topics and themes on ESG, because this is where things are heading. This is what interests the students. This is what the industry wants. And so that's why we have this summit. This is the second summit. The first one was 2 years ago in Brussels. And I think this is really a new and deep reorientation of the ECGI. Okay, so now, given that we're talking about climate change, let me now say a few words about what we're trying to mark as almost a 10-year anniversary, which is the climate conference and the climate Agreement of Paris in 2015, COP21. It's nearly 10 years ago. Maybe people don't understand it sufficiently. There's a before and an after COP21 Paris Agreement. For those of you who remember, before the Paris Agreement, things were sort of falling apart. We had a big setback of Copenhagen. Most countries were dropping out of the Kyoto Protocol, and there were only a few European countries left saying, yeah, we're going to continue with the Kyoto Protocol. So, by training, I'm an economist trained in contract theory. Okay, now contract theory. What's one word description of contract theory? Well, the parties to a contract, they try and maximize the surplus, and they face constraints. And there are two constraints essentially that they face: incentive compatibility constraints and participation constraints. And if you want, before Paris, there's a lot of focus on incentive compatibility, almost no focus on participation. And what's really been a sea change with Paris is that now we said, no, we need to focus on participation first. We need to bring everyone back around the table. And we're going to do that by taking a different approach, emphasizing voluntary contributions, emphasizing a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. Massive success from Paris, a sea change. And then another thing that Paris did, which was remarkable, before, the COP process was mostly governments talking together and trying to find an agreement. Paris organizers decided it's not just about governments, it's other parties, municipalities, business, the financial sector. It's the first time that the financial sector was represented at COP with the Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition. It really had a fundamental, accelerating effect in engaging with the finance industry. So, by 2022, we have 140 countries that have made net zero commitments. And that's about 91% of global CO2 emissions. And we've had 4,205, I've just looked this up, companies that have made commitments through SBTI by 2023. That's roughly 50% of listed companies in the world. So that's really a remarkable change. And so, what we want to address at the conference today is, well, how does that materialize? What kind of, how far has decarbonization gone, in particular in the financial sector? That will be the theme we're going to focus on this morning. But more generally, we will be interested in taking stock. How far have we gone? Now, probably all of you will agree with me if I say that, big successes, but it's probably, if we had to really, make an assessment, it's probably too little, and hopefully I may be misspeaking here, but probably too little and too late. Why too late? Well, because the goal of the Paris Agreement was let's not exceed 1.5 degree warming limit, okay? Well, this year, we've exceeded it. We've had a whole year uninterrupted of average temperatures that are higher than 1.5 degrees centigrade already in 2023 up to 2024. So it's too little, and I will end with this. So how should we look at the future? Well, what we need to learn from the Paris Agreement is that it's important to be ambitious. So why was Paris so successful? Because everyone wanted to do something outstanding. The ambitions were high. And we've sort of lost track of that. And so what we need today is really to raise our game, raise our ambition. And that's true both for governments, but also for businesses. We really have to feel that, well, we need to do much, much more. We need to set much more ambitious goals than we have done so far. Anyway, I don't want to, it's not my my talk here. We have a wonderful conference ahead of us, so I will end on that. And again, let me welcome you all. And so now I'm going to put on my hat as a moderator for the first session, which is the session on decarbonizing the financial sector. We have two papers, two presentations. Each presentation will be roughly 25-30 minutes. I think the presenters will be very happy with interruptions, but if there are no interruptions, there will be a 10-minute Q&A for us to be able to engage with what the findings of these studies, and the focus is, as I said, is on the banking sector, playing a fundamental role, of course, in decarbonization. So let me maybe introduce our first speaker, Boris Vallée, who is a professor of finance at Harvard Business School. And has been more and more engaged with the climate change issues in his research. And before that, he did some fabulous work on the financial crisis, the global financial crisis of 2007-2009.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for the kind introduction and for putting our paper on the program. So indeed, today we're going to be talking about decarbonizing the banking sector. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at somewhat of a case study of the coal sector. And there's a simple reason for studying the coal sector is that it is a larger source of CO2 emissions, mostly to produce power. So let me thank my co-author, Daniel Green, who is also at Harvard Business School, and I also wanted to thank Urgewald, and I know some of their employees are in the room, because they really helped us to provide data and also institutional detail in general, which was extremely valuable for us. Okay, so I'm sure in this room most people are familiar with the notion of exit policies and the abundant public debate that there is around it. I mean, it is viewed as a tool to accelerate the energy transition away from fossil fuel with the goal of limiting climate change. And for us economists, there is a very basic principle underlying it, is that if you constrict the supply, it should have an effect both the supply of capital, it should have an effect on the firm in their ability to raise capital, so rationing them or increasing the cost, and that this rationing should translate into real effect, which are the ultimate goal of the policies. And I think an important aspect here, which has been often raised as a counter-argument for this tool, is that there should be limited substitution from the players that are restricting their supply. And there is actually some research in the equity market, for instance, that shows that substitution is relatively easy there, and that not that much is achieved when the endowment of my university is saying that it will stop investing in oil and gas. And so with my co-author, we really spent some time trying to figure out what would be a context in which this tool would be the most likely to be effective. And so we ended up zeroing on the coal industry. And because of its economic significance to the CO2 emission, but also because it fitted a set of criteria that, in our view, made it more likely that the tool would have some bite. So one important aspect is that this industry is highly capitalistic, and it relies a lot on external funding to get this capital. And more specifically, to get this outside capital, it's largely relying on banks, so using bank intermediated debt. And what is interesting here is that we know from the abundant literature on bank lending that there are a lot of friction that should limit the substitutability of this capital. Because there is all this informational friction, there is all the value of this banking relationship. It should make it harder to substitute, and it's also that there is way less banks than there is equity investors, and so again, going in the direction of making it harder to substitute. And then a final reason why we look at coal is that we were simply listening to the world, and the whining, if I may say, was coming from the coal industry. Because our view is that if a tool was successful, most likely the industry would be very vocal about it. And for the coal, it is definitely the case that the industry has been complaining a lot against this campaign. And our view is that this tool, if proven effective, should be applied to other sectors that bear similar characteristics. And I think at least some part of the oil and gas industry would fit that bill. So our research question is pretty straightforward. I mean, we want to know whether the bank exit policies, they affect the financing and the real outcome of targeted firms, and whether, in that sense, they are an effective tool to mitigate climate change. And I think here we also want to have an idea of the magnitude, because there is many tools on the tables, but we need to be quite selective about them and getting a sense at whether they clearly move the needle or whether they are more marginal in the effects they can achieve. All right, so for the one familiar with my institution, you would know that case studies are at the heart of what we do. So let me start quickly by a small case study about Consol Energy, which is a US coal firm. And basically, that firm needed to roll over its revolver. And so on the left column, you can see the commitment that it had from its syndicate of bank. And then you can see post the rollover what took the place of the existing revolver. And interestingly for us, what we can see is that many banks are exiting that syndicate. Some are staying and some are entering. But as you see, if you look at the net is negative. So we have this sense of a rationing of the access to capital for that firm. And maybe even more interestingly for the purpose of our analysis, is that if we look at among the banks that left the syndicate, whether they had an exit policy, a binding exit policy, and I will be more specific by what I mean by that in a minute, whether they had such a policy in place, we can see that it highly correlates with the one that exited the syndicate. And so the rest of my talk is really about convincing you that this case study can be expanded to a large sample analysis. And so for the ones that are eager to us making a causal statement, so basically in a nutshell, our view is that we want to make a causal statement. I mean, we're trying to assess the efficacy of these tools. And so what we're going to be looking at basically is plausibly exogenous variation in the exposition of coal firms to these policies. And there is two main sources of variations that we can exploit in our empirical setting. One is that firms are banking with different banks, and so that there is this variation in the relationship. And then the strength and the timing of these policies also varies across banks. All right, so to kill the suspense and give you a quick preview of the results, basically, we first focus on trying to do as precise a measurement exercise as we can. And when we do that, an important takeaway is that size-weighted, most banks have actually a policy, an exit policy in place towards coal. As I mentioned, this is the seminal target of these policies. However, there is substantial heterogeneity in the strength and the timing that is largely explained by geography. And by that, it means that Europeans are leading the way, as in this conference. And so I think it's a very clear manifestation about how different continents are at different stages of this discussion. Then I think there is a lot of discussion around greenwashing and whether this is all cheap talk. And in our setting, it does look like the banks that we measure as having strong policies, they are indeed walking the talk and indeed restricting their supply of capital to coal firms. And so when turning to the coal firms themselves, we can therefore observe large effects that are consistent with the intended effect of these policies. And so, namely, we observe a drop in the quantity of financing that this firm can raise. We don't observe the substitution that was clearly the important caveat to this tool. And turning to real effects, we do observe some shrinkage of the asset and some higher likelihood of plant closures that translate into lower emissions. And we end the paper by trying to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how much emission have been saved thanks to these policies and how much could be saved if they were to be expanded. And we do end up finding some relatively large numbers that are by no means sufficient in themselves, but at least that seem first order to the problem we are looking at. All right, so let me jump the literature for the sake of time. I mean, I'm sure many in the room are familiar with this paper. It's a very active literature, which I think is very nice and stimulating, and so this has been a great development, I think, of the last couple of years that there is so much energy in this space. All right, so let me start with the measurement exercise. So as I mentioned, so this is the data we get from Urgewald. We obtain from them the data on the implementation of this exit policy. And to resonate with Patrick's word, you can see that the Paris agreement is really a discontinuity here. It's the inflection point from which financial institutions start to become very serious about the topic. And from then on, the momentum built. Okay, so not every exit policy is born equal, maybe without too much of a surprise. So 2 examples here. On the left, Wells Fargo, you might have heard about that bank. They make the news on a relatively regular basis. And on the right, Barclays. And so the left policy is a good example of a weak exit policy because basically the only thing they do is that they ban mountaintop removal, which is a very dirty way of extracting coal, but not so much in terms of CO2 emission, but in terms of water pollution. And on the right-hand side, you have a good example of what a strong exit policy here is, because typically they follow a schedule like that, progressively tightening the screws on their client to fully exit the activity in the middle term. And what I think is interesting is that you can see that the strength does not correlate with the length of the text by any means. And so talking about cheap talk, be careful about just measuring how many words there is related to the topic. Okay, so then we maybe quickly, without getting too much into the weed, what we do is that we try to convert these policies in sentence into some exploitable code for us. So we create a set of variables that will allow us to describe mathematically these policies. And so once we have this variable, you see, we can retranscribe the two policies I showed you into a simple algorithm. You can see here that the substance of the policies are massively different, and it's particularly visible once you convert them into this simple algorithm. And once we have that, basically we can look for the cross-section of banks, whether certain type of project will be more or less targeted in general by these policies. And so it evolves over time because, as I mentioned, most of these policies, they get more bite as time goes by. And here you can see that for the new project, for project finance, there is a large majority of exit policies that forbid this type of project. Yeah.
80% of which sort of device?
So that's conditional of having an exit policy. And then if you look at expansion, not new project, but expansion of existing project, you can see that we are close to 60%, so already a significant drop. And then if you look at corporate finance, which is typically the less targeted type of financing, you can see that here it's actually a minority that would be banned by this exit policy. And so what we do basically is that we define a set of scenarios, around 15 scenarios, and we see for each bank how many of these scenarios do they ban under these policies. And so, this is consistent with what I was showing you. Some scenarios are much more banned than others. And once we have that, we can look at the cross-section of ban strengths across the bank. And what we see basically is that it's a bit trimodal. There is some bans that are very strong. There is some bands that are very weak, and then there is a bunch in the middle. But in general, to us, that motivates the importance of being precise, because if we were just to use any exit policy and try to measure its effect, the reality is that many of them don't have any bite, and so we should therefore not be surprised that they don't have effect, and that doesn't mean that the tool was not effective. It can only be effective, of course, if it has some bite in the first place. Okay, so are they cheap talk? That is the concern, is that banks would only say they are exiting the coal industry because their activity was shrinking in the first place. So a reverse causality problem of some sort. And when we look at the determinants of adopting an exit policy and its strengths, this is not what we're seeing. So we don't see that it particularly correlates with the share of your lending that you are doing with the coal industry. And it also does not correlate with how are your clients in the coal industry doing in terms of their past credit demand. So really it's size of the bank, and then the geography, as I mentioned, with European banks being much more pronounced in their way, and that correlates with the ESG scores. And then if we contrast at an aggregate level, so this is not causal, but if we look at the aggregate lending of banks with a no or weak policy in place and compare them to the one with a strong policy, it is very reassuring to us to see that the banks with a strong policy are reducing more their lending to the coal industry than this control group. And so this is just showing the same, that both the existence and the strength of these policies are predictive of the lending activity towards the sector. Okay, so being economists, we love to be very clear about whether we are looking at supply or demand. And I think the case for this tool to be effective is that this is truly a shock coming from the supply of capital. And so what we do here to establish that is to do this classic Ala-Khwajamian type of regression, where we are identifying within a bank year, within a firm year, so controlling for their demand for capital, whether they get more capital from banks with a strong ban or with no or a weak ban. And the answer is that indeed they get less capital from the bank that have a strong ban in place. So this is reassuring us for the fact that indeed, some of these banks are cutting the supply of capital to these firms, but that does not answer the question about whether this translates into a rationing of debt, because they could substitute into other banks. So for making that aggregate firm level statement, we need two instruments. I mean, we need this exogenous variation, and so we are doing that in as large a sample as possible. And basically, what we're going to be doing is building this instrument, building this source of plausibly exogenous variation that is somewhat simply the weighted average of the strength of the bank with which you were historically transacting from. So you have your historic lender, and we do the weighted average of the strength of their exit policy. And this instrument is based on the stickiness of bank relationship, from the fact that you're much more likely to be transacting, to be borrowing from the bank with which you were historically in a relationship. And so here you see that really the spirit of our analysis is motivated by a friction, actually, by the fact that it's hard to switch from one bank to the other. I mean, I like these statistics for household that a given person is less likely to change bank than husband or wife over their lifetime. And so it's almost as true for firms, is that these relationships are extremely sticky. And this is what we are leveraging. I don't know what it says about our marriage, that our banking relationships are more robust, but this is really an empirical fact. Okay, and so to the question that I was motivating, the answer is yes. So in net effect at the firm level, more exposure to exit policies translate into a lower quantity of debt issuance. And reassuringly, when we do some cuts of the data, we see that this is particularly the case for firms that have a large share of their activity that is in the coal industry, and also that this is more pronounced for small firms, for whom financial friction are more likely to be large. And to the question of substitutability that I was mentioning, I mean, for us, it was really important to understand whether there was some leakage to other lenders. And so what we see is that this reduction in debt financing is coming from the banks that have a call policy, which is reassuring. It's coming from the relationship bank. And as you see on the other coefficient, which are also negative, there is no substitution. Otherwise, we would see a positive coefficient there that would come as an offset. Then when we look at non-banks, we do see a moderate substitution there. As you see, we have a positive 0.079 coefficient, but the baseline is much smaller. So it by no means offset what is happening in the non-bank. And interestingly as well, we don't see any substitution in the equity market, which is what like a naive application of the Modigliani and Miller theorem would say. But so again, we see that there is an important friction between debt and equity, and that in that case, it works to the advantage of the policies.
Because I would have been worried about overlapping policies, right? If in Europe you are exposed to a carbon price, so this you also want to reduce your emissions. So I'm guessing the country here fixed effects control to some extent for this. But then all of your groups are multinational, so I have to understand a little bit how you think about, where is the project, what is the country basically in your case?
Yes, no, so that's a very good question, and indeed we are by no means saying that this is the only shock that coal firms are meeting, because they are facing a lot of shocks. So there is regulatory shocks, and there is also demand shocks. For instance, in the US with the shale gas boom, that was much cheaper than coal. And so, exactly as you mentioned, the way we think about it is that our country year fixed effect are going to soak up most of that variation. So we abstract away from it. We are trying to absorb it. The way we think about country is that we use the country of the headquarters of the firm. It is not perfect for the multinational firm, but many of these firms actually are not that multinational. We have I went very quickly about it, but we have a global sample because for us it was very important to be global because most of the coal activity right now is happening in Asia. And so China, India, Indonesia, Philippines, all these countries are very important for coal right now. And so we have a lot of these firms in our sample, and these firms typically are not multinational in Asian countries.
How do you measure equity? Is this equity issuance?
Yes.
What about retained earnings and cuts in dividends? That's another way of building an equity stock.
Yes, no, that's fair. The data there was not as good for dividends in general. We would have loved to see whether there was a change in dividend policy that would be consistent with this rationing of capital, but we were not really comfortable making that point. So we stick to the extensive margining of equity and look at equity issuance, but that is a completely fair point. Okay, so this was the financial effect, and this is encouraging to see some financial effect. But let's be clear, the financial effect by themselves are not going to matter for saving the planet. What's going to matter is whether this is affecting operations. This is really the crux of it. As I said, in this industry, there is good reason to think that the financial effects are going to translate into real effect. But we could also imagine that we would observe no financial effect, but that there would be real effect. For instance, because firms are raising capital to change their business model and move away from coal. So really looking at real effect is crucial here. And what we first do is simple. We look at whether the size of their balance sheet is evolving when they get more exposed to exit policy. And what we see is that indeed there is a shrinkage of their asset base that is more modest than the effect we find on financial on debt issuance, but that is very consistent with the fact that it looks like it's affecting their growth prospect, either limiting their growth or speeding up their shrinkage because many of these firms are actually shrinking. And then we change level of observation and we move to a plant level analysis to try to get a sense of whether it matters at the asset level for the operation of this assets. And so here basically we're going to be running a hazard model on whether these plants are more likely to get shut down if they are more exposed to exit policies. And so what we observe is that indeed this is the case post Paris Climate Agreement, that the assets from the firms that are more exposed have a baseline by like 40% for one standard deviation of exposure, 40% more likelihood to be shut down over a similar period, and that is particularly true for small firms, which in general is what we expected, given that they face more financial constraints. And then we can finally look at what actually matters, is the CO2 emissions. And here, reassuringly, we do see a reduction in the emissions that is coming both from the extensive and intensive margin. So the third column is the extensive margin. It's whether these plants are active or not. And you see here a negative effect, so which is very consistent with what I just showed you, that these are more likely to be closed. But interestingly, they also are less operated, because if we restrict to active facilities, we see that there is less emission, even conditional on being active. Whereas the carbon intensity for producing 1 megawatt of electricity is actually unchanged. So what it suggests here is that they use less these facilities, possibly because it's harder to maintain them. I guess my answer to that question is not on its own, definitely not, but it can have a first order effect. And so we should throw whatever we have at this problem. And finance is definitely one thing we should we should throw at this problem. So basically, what we're doing is, it's a bit of an heroic exercise in the sense that we're going to lean a lot on the hazard model coefficients that I showed you. So if we take seriously that if you are strongly exposed to exit policy, you are significantly more likely to retire the asset. How can we extrapolate that number to first gauge how much was achieved with the existing policies, and second, how much would be achieved if every bank was adopting a strong policy? And so when we do that, so the black line is the current expected trajectory for the coal industry, and that dashed line represents what would have been absent the policies. So this is the effect that we are measuring in the aggregate, which is around 1 gigaton of emission, or 0.6 gigaton if you account for the fact that it was substituted into other sources of power that were likely to be emitting CO2 as well. But I think what I found the most interesting line is the second one, is like, what can we achieve if all the banks are to adopt? And I think this is a bit the topic of today, trying to trigger change. And what you see is that there is room to achieve much more there if every bank was adopting these strong policies. Then the bad news is that if we look at again the trajectory for staying below the 2-degree target that is modeled by the IPCC, and there are many of these scenarios, but I think this one is a representative one. What we see is that coal needs to be shrunk at a massive speed and to have any chance to stay below the target, and that these policies by themselves, they are too slow acting to bring us there. So we should definitely try to do it, but we should not take too much comfort even if every bank implements these policies, because the reality is that we need much faster action, again, to resonate with Patrick's words before. And so that's basically it on my end. So in a nutshell, we view this tool as an effective tool, both for financing and real effect, aligned with the intended goals. The economic magnitude in our eyes is significant. Importantly, we don't observe the substitution that has been brought forward so many times as a counter-argument to this tool. We observe some heterogeneity in the effectiveness, as expected, I would say. But as I was saying in this macro analysis, we should definitely encourage these policies. We should encourage them to be expanded to other sectors as well, while being aware of their limitation and that in themselves they will most likely not be sufficient to achieve the target. And that's it.
Okay, Beatrice, you go first.
Thank you. So thank you very much. This is a fascinating paper and a very optimistic message in some ways. But if you go back to the the slide before, I had a question there, which is my understanding is that at present the gigatons from coal are higher than that, 15 gigatons, not 8. So are you covering everything here, or is this just your sample of firms?
So we try to cover everything. Then one thing we're not accounting for here is the coming online of new facilities. Because so we start in 2010, but unfortunately, because we cannot really speak to these facilities that are just arriving. Unfortunately, there is a lot of geography in the world where facilities are still coming online. And so the reality is that this dark line, it is for the existing facilities as of 2010. But if I was to plot what has actually happened and what will most likely happen, we are looking at a different shape because we are still increasing the capacity of coal. Unfortunately, coal is the energy of the future. People don't have that image in mind because in Europe and in the US, it's not the case anymore. But globally, it is still increasing in quantity. So, I agree with your statement. And if anything, this might be another margin on which to try to act. But just econometrically, it was harder to speak to that margin.
Okay, so that would have been my second question. There are still a lot of new coal plants being opened as we speak, and I was wondering, if you still want to make, I mean, it will be a big effort to get all the finance aligned into a no coal policy or exit policy. Maybe it would just be better to lean more on the margin of regulation, and it is also a question of where you want to put the energy and the political capital, essentially.
Absolutely. And my take on that is that I by no means view private action as a substitute for regulatory and policy action. I think these are really complement. It's hard to measure the complementarity econometrically, but I would love to do that. But I suspect that these policies are particularly effective when they come on the back of policy and regulatory action. And so if anyone has a good idea to measuring these complementarities, I would love to do that, but I have not found yet a good setting to do that.
Okay, there are a bunch of questions. We're not that much time, so I'm going to take several in a row and let you answer them. Okay, Herman, we go first.
Can you tell us something about relative profitability of coal financing for the banks? And shouldn't that be considered as a counterfactual? Because that would really show that regulation is significant here.
All right, Mike.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Mike Wilkins from Imperial. I'm just wondering what your findings have in terms of implications for transition finance and for the managed phase-out of coal plants in developing countries such as Asia, because I think banks are trying to determine whether they should finance those activities or not, and whether this could show them some implications of exiting, because transition finance requires capital. And the objective is to bring down emissions through that transition financing, but it's still financing the sector.
Dirk and then Tom. And then I'll leave.
First of all, a compliment, because I really like that you look at the quantity rather than the price, what economists normally do, and that shows the powerful results. Secondly, it will be really interesting to translate this to oil and gas. And I'm wondering whether they have the same dependence on bank financing, because I'm involved in a pension fund, and in Europe there is a lot of divestment from oil and gas and zero effect so far. And I'm really wondering whether they also the same bank dependent or less, because that I find this is a good story. And oil and gas, I'm really wondering what can we do?
I mean, maybe Tom Gosling, LSE and ECGI, just picking up on that theme, it strikes me we have to be quite cautious about the extrapolation from, I really enjoyed your study actually, but the extrapolation into other contexts, because a really crucial context to your study is that in developed markets, thermal coal has been in secular decline since 2010. And I suspect that quite a lot of the result that you're getting is from developed market impacts. And I think it would be really interesting to separately analyse a couple of things. One is, if you just looked at developing markets where there hasn't been that secular decline, you don't have the same sort of straw that breaks a camel's back impact of bank lending policies. They're really trying to push water up a hill in that context. And secondly, if you looked at the asset level, I think what really counts is where the coal is being sold, not where it's being produced, and what type of coal it is. Is it low-cost coal? So Consul, your example, is an Eastern Seaboard producer that's a high-cost producer, so they're going to be one of the first to get hit. So I think that I took from your analysis that actually bank lending policies can be a really useful way to accelerate killing off something that's dying anyway, but I don't think we should extrapolate from that they're going to be effective in undermining profitable business segments.
Marco, you have the last question. I will add one point after you, and then I'll give Boris a chance.
So some of the coal mines and coal power plants are owned by sovereign entities, Coal Mongolia, Coal India. So to what extent can you distinguish between sovereigns, for example, issuing bonds, and then giving to their coal state-owned companies, as opposed to privately owned coal power plants? mines.
Okay, and my last question, which is adding to what Herman asked. So you are phasing out a coal operation, but what's the replacement energy? Is there a replacement energy? And if there isn't, is that what's holding back the scaling, the shutting down of coal?
Yeah, so let me start with this one. I mean, yes, I'm personally in favor of reducing consumption as much as we can, and I know in the US this is not a very popular message, but I think this will definitely be part of the equation. I don't think it works otherwise. But the thing with coal is that it is massively more pollutant than any other energy. And so any substitution is going to divide at least by 2 the amount of issuance. And so anything is better than coal here, which is also why we picked coal, because we thought it was the general equilibrium effect were unambiguous here. Okay, so Herman, on the profitability for the banking sector, our understanding, which we build also talking with financial institutions, is that for most banks, coal is a very small share of their portfolio. And so we had the CEO of a major US investment bank visiting our department, and he asked not to be quoted, but I'm sure you can find out who it was, who told us that their approach was to minimize headache. They didn't want too much activists to attack them, and given that it was very small for most diversified banks, they were comfortable putting a policy in place. I think another indication that it is not such a good deal is that we don't see a bank for coal appearing, which I think would be revelatory. If it was very profitable, some hedge fund would be comfortable becoming the bank for coal. And I mean, hedge fund or other entities, but we don't really observe that in the data, which suggests that it is not that profitable. On the question of transition financing, I mean, what is the design of the optimal financing? I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure we can say too much in our setting about that, apart from the fact that it does look like these policies can act as incentives towards changing the business model, and that the good policy doesn't stop lending. It conditions lending on certain criteria, leaving carve-outs for the switch to green, because indeed that requires a lot of investment. Okay, sorry for happy to answer the other question offline.
Well, that was a fantastic start, and we could have gone on, obviously, but time is running out. So our second speaker is Marcin Kacperczyk, who's my colleague and co-author at Imperial College, and he will give you a very, in some ways, complementary analysis to what we just heard. Marcin, you have 25 or 30 minutes. You want to have a...
Yeah, probably. I mean, not that I memorized all of this. So yes, thank you very much again for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I mean, at the start, I wanted one more time to thank the organizers, the host here at the embassy. I'm sure everyone will agree that's a wonderful venue, and the opportunity to be here is amazing. All this historic place where we are today. And of course, Elaine and Suzanne, Marco, and all the team at ECGI, you big kudos. Like I say, like I was quite impressed to see people respond to emails over the weekend that you don't see in Europe too often, so I hope you agree. So that was a kind of a different change of speed that I have observed from all of you, and thank you so much for coming today in the morning to listen to this. So Boris has done quite a lot of heavy lifting for me, because as Patrick said, what I'm going to talk about is going to be a little bit of a parallel stream to what Boris highlighted. And this is based on the work that I have done with a colleague of mine at Imperial College, Jose Luis Pedro. So what are we trying to do here? We are trying to actually understand the role of banks in the transition process, of course, to net zero. And we're going to take the more direct route related to the introduction that Patrick gave, which is essentially try to to understand what it is that Paris, in some sense, has brought on board as a way how banks kind of got engaged into this idea of decarbonization. And essentially, the kind of one short summary of the paper is to understand to what extent the initiative that sprang up around the Paris Agreement, that are the commitments initiatives, have actually led to some kind of meaningful response on the finance sector. And here the banking is going to be essentially the example. So of course, this paper here does not need a huge introduction. We know where we are in terms of the physical science. We are facing more and more stress in the way how the nature is actually responding to these climate shocks. And I think the first kind of thing for us to realize is like, where is the role of the humans in this? And I think I always like to cite physicists because they actually gave us this strong weapon that I use over and over in every talk I have, which essentially said that, look, we don't have this magic switch that we can just simply lower the temperatures, but because there is this tight link between what we emit and how the temperature responds, humans can actually control how much they emit. And by now, there is quite a lot of evidence that I don't think should be any more disputed, that actually a lot of what we observe in terms of the temperature increases in the world have to do with the level of emissions that we produce globally. So in the end, if we want to think about having a chance to actually get at some kind of meaningful reductions in temperatures, we need to think about this one word called decarbonization. So decarbonization, I think, is probably one of the most cited words in the context of climate finance. And here, of course, this was one of the main words also coming out of the COP21, the Paris Agreement, the kind of commitment that collectively we want to go into the world, which is going to bring us to this magic number 0, so-called net neutrality by mid of the century. And the point of this talk is not so much to argue how realistically it is to reach that point, it's more to say that there was a policy shift in a way that a lot of players, financial players, actually got into this kind of mode. Let's embrace it. Let's try to actually push as much as we can, and let's see how much actually we can achieve in terms of this kind of collective outcomes. And what's interesting about this idea of decarbonization is that there is kind of like a parallel view of this world. Of course, the traditional view of the environmental economists is that we all should leave it to governments, that we have this magic fairy called a carbon tax, and carbon tax is going to solve the problem of decarbonization. Let's impose it on all the polluters, and that problem solved. And I think in some sense it's beautiful to have a model that is so elegant and it kind of can give us a lot of kind of intuition. At the same time, I always think of this one unintended consequence that it actually produced, which is essentially inertia. Because everyone kind of believed that the government is here to solve the problem. No one else was doing anything. Everyone was just looking at one player, let them deal with the problem, and we will just benefit from that. Of course, we know from observing the practice that that has not materialized. We have not observed that this carbon tax has been implemented at large, such that we could have achieved this particular decarbonization. And that essentially was, in some sense, a big insight of the Paris Agreement, to recognize the fact that governments cannot be the only players in this, that we need to be more collective in the way how we deal with it. And of course, the private sector has kind of been invited to take a role in this. And I think now what we kind of came to recognize as a result of quite a few years post-Paris is that this kind of match, or the patchwork approach, as I call it, is potentially a more successful way to deal with it. Even though we are kind of sacrificing what economists call the first best solution, this first best solution that doesn't work is actually not a better solution than the worst kind of best solution that has some kind of success here and there. And I think this is the kind of context I want you to think about banks as one of these players that contributed to the debate, that we kind of shifted to the world that we want to actually talk about financial institutions, and banks and financial sector specifically can actually play this role in this particular scene. And of course, the question is how big that role is. To what extent have we observed that these financial institutions have actually embraced this idea? So that's the first question. That's what Boris was also talking to about. Is this really just a response to some kind of media-driven sentiment that the banks are kind of just simply doing the greenwashing? Or is there actually a real kind of response in the way how they are shifting their policies? And then, of course, the big elephant in the room that we always talk about is this idea, even if these financial institutions are responding to incentives, is the real sector actually doing something as a result of that? So that has been actually a much more difficult question to actually answer. We have seen quite a lot of evidence to date that financial institutions have actually changed in the way how they behave with response to climate. I think what we have kind of less success with or less evidence on to begin with is this idea, did it actually lead to some kind of real decarbonization? So I'm going to revisit these two questions in the context of this banking sector. So the idea here is, why looking at banks? So of course, we all are very familiar with the banking sector, and it goes without saying that banks play a big role in the way how they channel resources from one party to another in the kind of standard intermediation process. They can also impose the kind of constraint on potential misbehaving parties, both through the quantity and price, as Dirk was talking just at the end of this previous presentation. But I think what we need to also recognize in the context of banks is something much more attractive. As much as we like financial markets, the kind of traded securities market, we all get fascinated because there is so much data on that. What we oftentimes miss in this discussion is how little actually moat, how narrow of the moat the financial sector has from the securities market. If you look at the scope of activities that actually contributes to the pollution in the world, there is actually very little that can be controlled by the publicly traded securities. Roughly, I don't know, 15 to 20%, maybe a little bit more depending how you want to measure that, is actually under this influence of the publicly traded markets. Whereas if you look at something like banks, banks are everywhere. Banks are in the developed markets, banks are in the emerging markets. So in this regard, they have this much bigger reach in the way how they can actually engage with the polluting sector. And if we think about actually some kind of form of penalty, especially coming to the emerging markets, there is no better player actually than this kind of institutions, because they have the most of this relationship between the polluters and the capital that they actually represent. So what we have observed over recent last few years is this notion that banks have been more and more engaged in this process of actually trying to impose some kind of friction on this. You may want to ask yourself why this is the case. I mean, this is not the purpose of this paper. Of course, big player in this has been central banks. Central banks have been actually pushing the commercial banks to actually participate in the decarbonization. But I think another element of this is also the whole stakeholder pressure. If you talk to corporate executives in a kind of private conversation, very rarely would they tell you, I do it because I care so deeply about climate. That's a sad kind of fact, but this is how they tell you. They tell you, I do it because I have someone outside my door telling me that I actually have to do something. So that's why that collective voice outside has such a big power, because without that, these bankers would not necessarily care as much as we would like them to care. So in this regard, it's important to recognize that that's what's driving that. And the important thing is that they actually have a lot of capital to play with. I mean, here I have some numbers here. They are definitely understatement, but essentially we're talking about trillions of dollars of capital that has been channeled from banks toward financing some kind of broadly defined fossil fuel industry. And what's also important about it is that, of course, in terms of like how this capital works, it's a much more sticky capital. When we think about someone like a hedge fund or an institutional kind of investor, in the way how they apply their pressure, it's very easy for them to shift. Like we have seen it from large institutional investors, how quarter over quarter out of a sudden they kind of negate on what they have promised. I mean, I don't want to put the names here because maybe this is not an occasion for that, but we know that. When it comes to banks, these relationships are much more lasting. So in this regard, conditional on shifting, you have a much higher chance that this is going to actually persist, rather than this is just going to be a fluke of one quarter, etc. Question?
I was thinking, are you also facing any of the countervailing pressures? So the banks You're talking about how they're facing the pressure to facilitate the decarbonization, but the anti-ESG backlash in the US, and also some of the reputational sort of green hushing as a response to greenwashing concerns, because you mentioned that, and that's a thesis of the paper. It would be interesting to see if you're seeing any of that come through as well.
Yeah, I think we've also have seen it, and I think this contrast between US versus non-US and how it has kind of dealt with the pressure is very stark. I'm not going to talk much about that, but just an example, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. In the context of the SBTI commitments, which I will be talking about, there is essentially not a single US bank that had made commitment in that period that we are looking at. So that already tells you something about what we are dealing with. Most of the banks that actually engage with SBTI in the early stage were the banks outside of the US. But of course, these banks also affect US through lending activity. So in this regard, US is being represented on the borrowing side, not necessarily on the lending side. And I think the more recent examples, and I'm sure everyone is familiar of certain banks kind of pulling out from the Net Zero Banking Alliance or from other initiatives, that's that exactly effect. So yeah, I don't have much to say about it other than it's very sad that they are doing this, and I think we should encourage them not to do it. But at the same time, of course, we want to understand how much it matters whether they actually are there or not. So that's related more to what I'm studying here in this paper. All right, so let me now go a little bit more into the specifics. So essentially, as I said, we want to understand two questions here. To what extent banks actually do get engaged in some kind of notion of decarbonization of their portfolios, and then subsequently, do they actually affect the real sector, how it responds to this particular pressure? And the context here is going to be bank commitments, specific commitments through the SBTI initiative. So we are going to look at the subset of banks that in the period of our analysis have actually made formal commitment to SBTI. And we are going to look at the activity of these banks in terms of their lending and trace it down to the corporate sector and try to compare it to the alternative setting in which actually these corporates do not rely on the lender who has not actually made this particular commitment. So what's interesting here to recognize is that, of course, the decision whether you make a commitment or not is endogenous. The banks decided on some kind of principle. There is a reason why they are doing it. So we are not going to argue that this is random, why you join this or not. But what's interesting is that if you look at the corporates, you can actually argue that this is more plausibly random because corporates don't affect whether the bank actually joins the initiative as much as the banks themselves decide. And more so, what we are going to argue here is that we are going to try to look at the relationships between corporates and banks way before SBTI actually came to existence. So we are going to condition that these relationships actually already existed like as far as 5 to 10 years before actually the bank made a commitment. And given that SBTI did not exist actually before, that's an even stronger case that this relationship have not been formed because of SBTI, that this has been actually something that had nothing to do with the bank policy to actually impose some kind of penalty on the sector. And what's interesting here is we are going to observe this entrance of certain banks into SBTI over time. So that allows you to control for some kind of potentially confounding effects which are specific about a period when a bank enters. That's what we call the staggered difference in differences estimation. So now the important limitation of this study to some extent is the banking data. So I, working at the university, don't have a luxury of observing the credit register of banks. So as such, the study is going to be based on the syndicated loan market. That's the data that academics typically have access to. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that, essentially we are talking about the kind of collection of financial institutions or banks that decide jointly to actually raise capital and lend it to a particular corporate. And then there is usually a notion of a lead, basically underwriter or lead banker, and the others that join that particular syndicate. Turns out that this form of lending is actually a pretty popular form of lending, especially with response to the larger kind of companies in this world. So there is a kind of selection of what type of lending we observe, but at the end of the day, it's actually not as big. So the rest of the kind of response variables we are going to be looking here are pretty standard. Just to mention, we are going to be trying to understand how this corporate sector responds in terms of their emissions. So we're going to be looking both at the direct and indirect emissions. And I will also have something to tell you about how this actually affects what we call the ESG ratings. And that rating is going to specifically come from MSCI. So briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar, SBTI is one of the most popular vehicles by which institutions can commit to decarbonization. It has been formed by essentially an initiative of various players, starting from Carbon Disclosure Project, the UN Global Compact, Worldwide Fund for Nature, and the World Resource Institute. That has kind of started around the Paris Agreement, slightly before 2015. And then importantly, in the context of banks, when banks actually commit to SBTI, essentially one of the stipulations, and this is the Article 2.1c, is that they are making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low green gas emissions. So essentially you can think of it as portfolio is being geared towards the decarbonization. But not only that, what's important also to recognize is that when the bank makes commitment, essentially it's kind of manifesting its own mindset, what it is that it thinks about this problem. So you don't need to necessarily tie it specifically to what SBTI says. You can think of it as just a shock to some kind of belief about is climate important to us as a bank or not. And Patrick has mentioned that this initiative has been extremely rapidly growing. Here I have a clear understatement of the numbers. This is actually evolving very fast, but we are talking about thousands of institutions that have joined SBTI. Not so many banks, as it turns out, in the sample. So maybe in the interest of time, the only thing I want to mention here is that in the sample we are going to be looking at, which is going to be restricted from the early stage of the SBTI, we're going to finish in 2018. We're going to be looking at roughly 35 to 40 banks that made the commitment. But in the way how we can link it to the data that we are using, we are going to be looking at 22 large banks that are part of our sample. So you may think that this is actually a pretty small sample because you have only 22 banks. But the big strength of this exercise is that these are all very large banks. So in this regard, because we are looking at the corporates, we are going to be dealing with hundreds of companies that are affected by the decision of these banks. And that's ultimately what drives our identification, not so much the bank level data. So just to give you an idea, within the sample of companies with the syndicated loan access, we are going to have more than 2,100 of such companies. Almost 1,500 of those companies are going to be affected by at least one of the banks lending capital to them that makes a commitment to SBTI. So this is roughly at the peak of this initiative, 60% of the total number of companies that are going to be what we call treated. They are the companies that at some point in time had a relationship with a bank that actually made a commitment to decarbonization. And then what we will try to understand as a result of this commitment, to what extent the bank lending policy discriminated between companies that actually are high versus low emission footprint companies. So that will be that third kind of dimension of comparison. How is it that I behave prior to the commitment, after commitment, conditional on whether I made the commitment or not, and also conditional on actually my level of emissions. So this is a little bit maybe too much, but this is an empirical specification, essentially what I said in Word. So we are looking at this interaction between the kind of double difference, which is before and after for those who commit versus those who do not, and their carbon footprint measured in terms of the log of the Scope 1 emissions. So that will be the coefficient of interest that we are trying to identify in this particular setting. So let me now kind of give you in the last 10 minutes some preview of the results that we found out of this exercise. So the first question, of course, that is interesting for us to understand is to what extent actually banks are doing what they are saying. Do we actually find evidence that these banks are actually restricting credit to companies with higher carbon footprint as they actually enter the SBTI initiative? So this is the result that shows you at the firm level. We are looking at all the firms in our sample. What's the level of your total debt conditional on whether you are exposed to the committing bank or not, and conditional on your level of emissions. So just please focus on the first row, which tells you exactly that differential effects, your level of emissions and that post versus pre-effect. And what you find throughout all of these specifications, which have a number of different controls throughout, is that there is a strong negative relationship of the companies that are subjected to the committing bank, the larger is their emission. So essentially, the short interpretation of this fact is that actually companies with higher carbon footprint and exposure to the committing bank are subsequently observing lower level of debts in their capital structure. So what's interesting about that specification, which is important to note, this is a total debt of a company. So essentially, that's already taking this net effect of a substitution that Boris talked about. So we are not just talking about debt that comes from the banks that commit. It's actually a total debt that the company is able to attract, which tells you that there is no perfect substitution coming from someone else. So that's actually a powerful result, because that's net of anything else that these companies could have done, conditional on facing that particular shock. So there seems to be actually a restriction in quantity, at least of debt that we are observing in this particular regression. And then, of course, the question that becomes interesting, how does it distribute between bank versus non-bank debt? We know that companies can also attract capital through non-bank debt, even in the debt market. And that's actually very stark, because when you condition on where this total debt comes from, and you separate the bank debt from non-bank debt, you see that all the effect actually comes from the bank debt. So that's exactly where the shock is localized. And just to give you some idea of magnitudes, per 1 standard deviation of emissions, we are talking about a reduction of roughly 12% in terms of the total debt coming from banks. At the same time, you see there is no substitution from non-banks. That effect is zero. So they are neither restricting nor actually arbitraging away that gap that opens up as a result of the retrenchment for the banking sector from these particular companies. So this is kind of a visual illustration of what's happening. On the left side, we are looking at the companies that are exposed. On the right side, the companies that are not. And the vertical red line is telling you exactly where the first shock happens. And what you can see here is the essentially plot of the coefficients of emissions of different companies period by period. And you see that for the companies that got affected, prior to the policy shift, there was literally no difference in the way how these companies attracted capital depending on their emissions. Whether you were high or low emission companies, you had exactly the same kind of exposure to the banking debt prior to that shock. It's actually pretty much zero. And then you see for the treated companies, there is a massive drop that happens right when these policies have been rolled out, which is exactly what you would expect if you think that this is exactly what has triggered that particular shift. And then, of course, as a counterfactual of that story, is the right side, which tells you what happened with the companies that were not exposed to the shock. And essentially, from that picture, you can see nothing happened. They have not observed a similar kind of decline in the way how they are actually observing their debt levels. So that tells you that that difference is coming precisely from the treatment group, not from some kind of differential effect between the treatment and the control group. So then there is another thing, which is essentially the story of what do banks really do? So one of the things I mentioned earlier is this idea that banks have a lasting relationship with their client. This is good and bad. Good, of course, is that if they change, then there is a hope they will persist. Bad is that if they were actually lending to a bad polluter before, it's typically very difficult for them to get out of the relationship, because there are, of course, reputational penalties, etc., that could be associated with that. And this is what we are trying to actually identify here. To what extent this is actually coming from the intensive versus extensive margin. And when I say intensive, I mean relocation of credit for the existing contracts, and extensive meaning the new contracts being initiated. And what you see is that essentially the whole effect is coming from the new originations. So what banks are doing are not really penalizing so much the existing clients, they are just simply not initiating new contracts with the new clients. And given that the typical contract is roughly 5 years, that tells you how long potentially it would take for this to churn around on average. Of course, that does not mean every contract is 5 years. What's also useful in this particular regression, this is a loan level regression now, is that you can absorb this demand shock, similar to what Boris said with the firm times time fixed effects and different kind of characteristics. So essentially what we are trying to identify here is the supply effect rather than the demand effect that is driving this effect.
So basically, if they do renewal, then there is an option to go out.
That's correct.
Renewal, they step up.
That's correct, yes. Yeah. Okay, so now there is of course the question of, is this only quantity, is there a price effect? Coming to Dirk's earlier comment, turns out there is a little bit of a price effect. Prices go up for the new borrowers, but the effect is tiny. So essentially, this is mostly the quantity story rather than the price story, which I think is encouraging because we learned from other examples of carbon basically tax that quantity usually is a much more powerful policy tool than it's actually the price effect. So that's consistent in this particular results. So then in the last 5 minutes, I wanted to tell you the kind of big elephant in the room question, or answer to that. Does it actually all matter? We know that banks are putting pressure. They are actually walking of what they are talking. The question is, do firms absorb that shock? So this is the second part of the paper where we look at the real effects. And here are a couple of very interesting observations. Observation number one is, these shocks are powerful enough, in a sense that we observe that in the presence of the shocks, firms behave as a standard corporate finance prediction would tell you in the presence of financing constraint. So Patrick has a beautiful paper that we cite, but there are some others as well following on that, which tell us what it is that we should be expecting if the company is facing any kind of financing shock. It doesn't have to be emissions. It's just basically restriction of credit. And we find exactly evidence that is consistent with what you would expect the companies to do. They delever, they reduce the number of assets, they increase the level of liquid assets, they reduce capex, and all consistent with that. There is one extra result, which is in the last column, which to me actually is a big message. I've been thinking about it for many years now because it really sticks in my mind, and very much is interesting contrast to Boris's result. What we also observe in this result is that on average, the ROA of these companies that are exposed to this shock goes up, which is kind of a little bit at first paradoxical. What's happening? These firms are being actually punished, and yet their profitability goes up. And then you start thinking about it and you recognize that that's perfectly consistent with the story where now these managers seeing the shock are gonna basically walk the profit margin kind of argument. Let me cut the projects which are the least profitable, and that's basically going to absorb the cost that increases as a result of the financing. So essentially you can think of it some kind of target policy. I wanna maintain my profit margin, I see the higher cost, so I need to do something with the benefit side. And what they do essentially is, on average, these projects become more profitable, which tells you that they must be cutting some projects which are less profitable.
Could it be the case that the perimeter of the firm is changing and they are selling assets that are high emitting, and therefore, it's like a mechanical result?
That's actually the next step. So then, of course, the natural question is, what are these projects that they are cutting? In the kind of banking world, if they truly want to see the policy to work, they would hope that the projects that get cut are the projects that are high emission projects. Yeah. So this is the next layer of our analysis, that now we are looking actually at the effect of this basically shock on the future Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Here I'm just showing you Scope 1 emissions. Importantly, I show you this up to 3 years into the future. So you may argue it takes some time for these companies to do something, and we do it either 1, 2, 3 or cumulatively over time. And if you look at columns 1 through 5, essentially the simple message is no result. So we find even though these companies are feeling there is a financing restriction, they are actually not responding by decarbonizing their operations. But then you look at columns 6 through 11 and you find something interesting. Now you are starting to look at how the companies may potentially communicate to banks what they are doing. And here we are looking at the so-called ESG scores. This is an MSCI scores. And we notice that as a result of the shock, in column 8, so-called E-score, or the environmental score, dramatically goes up. Okay? So this is interesting because to many people in this literature that suggests, oh, these companies are getting better. They have a higher environmental score, so the policy works. So we kind of were intrigued by that because, of course, we didn't see the emission effect. We said, like, why is this effect actually going up? this is what we are doing next. We are trying to dig into the determinants of this environmental score and see where is this actually coming from? Where is that high value of E-score coming from? And just in the interest of time, let's look at columns 5 through 9, which is the subcomponents of this E-score. And if you look at the subcomponents, you can see that among all of them, there is just one that drives this E-score up. And this is what is called environmental opportunities. It's a little bit of a fuzzy name, but if you start reading about this, a lot of this is essentially communication tool. So you as a company are coming and are saying, we commit to become better in the future. And MSCI says, great, this is what we want to hear, score. You know, but of course, if you think about what banks are wanting to see, is not necessarily this E-score to go up. They want the decarbonization to go down. So if you take the point into some kind of fixed point equilibrium, the fact that this constraint still bind tells you that the banks are actually not getting fooled. They are actually not taking this as a credible kind of communication. So that brings me to the end. So essentially, what I want to say is that there is actually a change of a paradigm, and financial institutions such as banks are actually very important in the way how we want to actually see this happen. So we do actually observe that banks specifically, in response to the post-Paris kind of initiatives such as SBTI, did respond with some kind of policy to restrain credit or make it at least more difficult to get. Companies have felt that this shock was credible, but of course, as a way of basically internalizing the shock, they found that there are different ways by which they can respond. And unfortunately, in this early stage of commitments, the response was not necessarily aligned fully with what the bank would have actually hoped to see, which is the decarbonization of the companies. So, but maybe just one kind of point out of this. In the context of coal that Boris talked about, it's kind of easier to see how the monoline company that just does coal can actually respond by reducing its carbon footprint, closing out plants, because there is nothing else that these companies do. This is just a coal business. But now if you go to the world where companies have multiple lines, this actually becomes much more complicated because it's no longer one-dimensional problem. It's a multi-dimensional problem, and this is a choice for the company how they want to actually absorb these shocks. And not necessarily decarbonization is the most kind of potent path for these companies to take forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcin. We have, again, 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay, Estelle, you were the first one to raise your hand.
Yes, thank you. So we just heard two papers looking at the impact of the banking channel on the financing of fossil fuel industry. And I'm trying to square this with a paper that I read a few years ago, and I'm hoping that you know what it is, which paper it is. It's a paper by Stephen Genna and co-authors at the University of Zurich. And what I remembered from that paper is that he showed that there was a shift in terms of the fossil fuel financing from capital markets and private equity to banks, to the banking sector. And so in some ways, that seemed to be contradictory to what you're doing. And given that I'm not a finance person, I'm just hoping you'll help me understand what this is.
Well, that's great. So I actually skipped one slide that may be actually potentially interesting and useful to answer that. So this is that slide that shows you what it is that's happening with the bank when they actually restrict that credit. So there are two ways to think about it. One way that could happen is that banks are actually going to finance these brown companies to let them restructure. The other one is that this is like a penalty, basically shock, that they don't want to deal with this fossil fuel sector. And the evidence from this table tells you that this is rather than latter, rather than former. So what we actually observe that there is a relocation of credit away from the brown companies, this is the bottom part of this graph, towards the green companies. So in this regard, even if the banks, as you said, are engaging more with the decarbonization, they are actually engaging, at least according to our findings, with financing the green companies rather than potentially renewables or something else, rather than actually trying to engage with the decarbonization process of the brown companies. They are actually moving away from these companies on average.
Okay, Marco.
So have you tried state ownership dummy in your regression? Because that was the previous question. I mean, you would expect that they are less constrained. And then have you, maybe with Boris, now that you've met, maybe you could check how much SBTI overlaps with reclaimed finance as an identification variable?
Yeah, we could. The latter we have not done. We could. When you say state, you mean location variable here, or when you say state, it's the ownership. Okay, whether it's public or private ownership. Yes, I think in these are actually pretty much all privately owned companies. So I don't think we have many because these are the data that come from something like CompuStat, etc. So to my knowledge, most of these companies would be basically the privately owned companies.
Okay, we reached a point where we have to collect multiple questions. So you go first, Sophie second, and Beatrice third.
So I'd like to know your views on the science-based targets. My understanding is that they are global, and therefore it will apply differentially in Europe versus other less, modernized areas, right? And therefore, where do you find strongest your results? Is it just in Europe, or is it beyond Europe? Just to have an assessment of the importance of these pathways.
So this is really good, and it's actually consistent with what I'm seeing on boards. So I serve on public boards and private boards of companies and investment funds. On the corporate side, we are seeing the push to get rid of the assets, to go to green. It's a quick fix, sadly. And I actually think it's not necessarily consistent with long-term interest from a societal level. So I think the pressure on the investor side is that. And the result is that you're seeing investor money, a certain type of investor money, which is not going to be EU taxonomy money, going into the brown assets. And those are having a higher ROI because they have a higher cost of capital. So oddly, the outcome is that companies that are in between the green and the brown, are paying a very high price. The very green are getting the upside, and the very brown are getting the upside. So I think it'll be interesting to get some research on the impact of the spin-offs of those assets. That's my first question. The second is a comment more than a question. The second is Africa. So I serve on an African board. And this is a very, if I can say, Western-looking approach. The push in Africa is we need energy. We don't care how we get it, but we need it. So I think that'll be interesting in the future to look at from a policy perspective and foreign direct investment there. Thank you.
Great paper.
Beatrice, you have the last question.
Yeah, just very provocatively. I mean, one way to look at these two papers is that they come to the opposite conclusion, namely a mildly optimistic one from the first one and a totally pessimistic. I mean, if you put this into gigatons saved, the answer is 0.
Okay, shall I quickly respond? So the first on Mireia question, I think we have not done it in the paper, but we have kind of explored it a little bit, maybe not surprisingly, but Europe was the one that the shock is kind of the strongest. So the US was the weakest, but it's kind of a little bit tricky. Like what we need to also recognize is this kind of common tension between screening versus monitoring. So that's very hard to observe in the data. So it could be that actually the US companies are doing the process in a different way. So maybe they are not actually rational capital. Maybe there is more actually monitoring and enforcement of some particular policies. So we don't have an ability to answer that question. But clearly, there seems to be some divide consistent with what you said. So Sophie, really happy to hear that at least we are consistent with what you see in practice. That's always what you want to achieve. And I think it's a great comment on this non-linearity. I think that polarization is very important. And yeah, this is something that would be really useful for us to explore more, like how do you get out of that, in some sense, bad equilibrium in a way. And then on Beatrice's question, I think it's a very good question, which is how do we think about basically this process from these two kind of papers. Again, I kind of think I'm not as negative as you on that, because what I actually find encouraging from the findings that we find is that the shock at least moves the needle. So the worst case would be if this shock actually did nothing to the corporate. Suppose you have someone who says, I want you to decarbonize, and you look at their standard corporate policies and you see essentially no response. That would be the worst of the outcomes I could observe. The fact that they actually do internalize that shock is actually potentially a good news, because that may tell you either we are talking about some kind of transitory equilibrium, they think that maybe this is just not permanent so we can actually play that game, or maybe what we need is just ramp up the size of the shock. This is a little bit the story of how high the carbon price should be, right? And that tells you that maybe if I raise the bar even higher, it will be harder and harder for these companies to actually do something about it. So maybe, yeah, let's treat it as a glass half full rather than half empty. But these are good observations.
A round of applause.